Hello, hello, hello. It's your boy, Wild Philosopher, here to remind you that gnomes are real. My friend Ryan is back today. Today we will be going over what is a fairy. We will be doing a deep dive into folkloric traditions, looking at memorits, looking at place names, looking at recorded beliefs in connection to the Fey folk, examining, maybe we'll touch a little on archaeology. And today we will be discussing what is a fairy, how can we sort of approach our sources about fairies, if not fairies themselves, and what isn't a fairy, because a lot of the time when you see these videos, you are fed very weird theories about fallen deities or demons in disguise or social constructs. So yeah, we will be discussing what is a fairy, focusing mostly on memorits, which are, just to remind those of you not listened to our vampire stream, stories about fairies which can be distinguished from legends by the fact that they are or purport to be actually real. They either were supposed to have occurred to a real person or were related by that person themselves, because many memorits blend into or might even be seen as identical with, in some respects, to supernatural encounters. We will be looking at legends too, but more as adjuncts. And then we will also be looking at place names, people names. A lot of fairy lore survive, well, maybe not too much nowadays, but a lot of names like Alfred. That's what you call that? Not a is that a theonym if it's a fairy name? Pheronym, nomonym,
Pheronym.
pheronym.
I mean, it doesn't contain the name of a god, just the word elf.
Yeah, but yeah, whole bunch of names, stuff like that, have survived and contain elf in them. Contain Actually, I don't think any names contain dwarf, but you do got other names passing folklore down to today. Um, and then, of course, there's all the miscellaneous folklore beliefs about fairies, such as putting your shoes on backwards if you get disoriented. Oh, I say disoriented. If you're in the woods and can no longer find your way, leaving a little dish of milk by the stove, etc., and the beliefs that drive these. We will be starting with a description of the behavior and function of fairies, mostly in Europe, but we might range out to the rest of the world. If we have time, we're not sure if this will be one or multiple sessions. After we're done explaining the behavior and function, we will launch into what are some popular beliefs about fairies that are false. Obviously, the Tinkerbell motif is not quite accurate, but there's a whole bunch of other proposed, more rational alternatives that are, frankly, ridiculous. And then after that, we will be presenting our own thesis, if you can call it that, as to what a fairy is. Is there anything else we should add?
I think that about covers it.
Yeah, maybe the only thing I might add, although I'll probably have to bring it up again throughout the stream as people come in, is question about how do we approach fairies in folk tales? Because I feel a lot of scholars tend to approach them as literary characters, which, I mean, at one level that's not false, because obviously in a folk tale everyone's a character. But it leads to them treating them as static images, whereas the writer of the folk tale is trying to represent the fairy as a real person.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I think, is maybe an important point about methodology, that I think one of the reasons to treat fairies in folklore as if they were real, quote, is not the question of whether or not fairies actually exist. It's simply the fact that the people who transmitted these stories to us believed they existed, and in many cases believed they were relating real encounters with them. And we're not just doing a disservice, we're also in error if we treat them as purely literary inventions. Same goes for people, of course. This perennial issue with studying historical figures through the lens of literature, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, with that, I will pass the puck to you. So
All
fairy
right.
behavior and function.
All right. Well, I guess one way to approach behavior, one of the common methods that me and wild philosopher use, is we like to look at their function, right? We like to look at behaviors, the way they behave, the consequences that comes as a result of meeting them. A lot of those elements tell us a lot about what they are and what they do, and how what they were in the mind of and are in the minds of so many in the past. I guess one thing um, I think people get caught up on when they think of fairy. All right, you have sort of the typical approach. There's the what I call the very I, I guess the our own the popular image of the fairy is the little Tinkerbell sprite. It's usually a couple inches in length. It has bug wings, or wings that you'd seen typically on bugs, which can range from butterflies to dragonflies to
Yeah.
all sorts of different things.
Yeah, either that or some sort of Lovecraftian monstrosity from
Well,
Lord of the
I was going to
Rings.
get to that. Then there's what I call the basic bitch understanding of fairies.
We're not
Pardon
10
my
minutes in yet, don't swear.
pardon my language, but it really is it really is that, because there's this secondary notion that upon delving further into the folklore and you decide to pop a book open for once and you're like, oh, they're just insane, an interdimensional beings that want to devour your souls or something.
Yeah.
That is, I think, possibly worse than the first idea of fairies, or the primary idea of fairies, like the cultural, very just typical standard, like that, like the Disneyfied version, because that one actually retains the more pure aspects of fairies, and we'll go into that soon enough. The second one is just people being morons.
Yeah,
No
it's
offense if you think that.
I think both are wrong. Uh, both equally wrong, I would say. I
Mhm.
think the difference is, yeah, the first one has a much more positive effect on your character, whereas the latter lets us embrace our more cynical, dark, and twisted aspirations regarding the external world.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. So um, I guess before we start going into what fairies are more consistently, uh, or how they more consistently act in the folklore and what that entails, there are some nice reading material I would actually suggest for people to check out, uh, in order to kind of acquaint yourself with the uh, the uh, the material a little more. So if you really want a primer or something that kind of goes a bit more scholarly into the topic of fairies, I would recommend the Mythology of Fairies by Thomas Keightley. That one is a fairly decent collection of fairy lore from mainly from Europe.
Yeah.
That was compiled, I think, in the late 1800s, um, or maybe early 1900s. I don't remember, but somewhere around that time period.
Early 1800s, because
Early.
Goethe
Oh,
gave a favorable review of
oh,
the
I
book.
see. Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's how you
Oh,
remember the dating on that one. And
okay.
Goethe died roughly 1830.
Oh, I see. All right. Oh, even better then.
Yes.
There's the Welsh Fairy book by W. Jenkins Thomas for some elements of fairy lore on Welsh fairies. Um, there is also, I would suggest, Eddie Lenahan's Meeting the Other Crowd. That one's a little more modern, but that is a nice compilation of some of traditional, what you'd call like storytelling, Irish storytelling. More concerned with, of course, the fairies. There's also Simon Young's Magical Folk, which is also a collection of different essays on the topic of fairy beliefs. That one goes into etymology, place names, yada yada. Uh, I would also suggest Mary Louise Ciodet's Celtic God and Heroes. That one touches a little more specifically on Irish mythology, but that does relate to fairy lore in many ways, so it is kind of useful for that purpose. There is the Hidden History of Elves and Dwarves by Claude Lecouteux. That one is good for the data it presents, perhaps not so much for the interpretations, but we'll get into that a little later.
Yeah.
And there are a lot. There's some more I could.
Yeah.
We
We could list dozens. KM Briggs has some amazing stuff on English fairies. Linda J. Ivanitz has Russian folk belief on Russian fairies. There's I cannot remember the name, but I have a lovely little book on just called Norwegian fairies and folklore. Yeah, like you can. There's a lot of books, and once you actually start reading one or two and look in the bibliography, which is your best friend, Tor Bringsveard, Phantoms and Fairies from Norwegian Folklore. Lovely book, although it is a quintessential instance of the if one skeptical argument doesn't work, try 18 defense. But yeah, if your best friend is always going to be bibliographies, right?
Yeah.
So Nancy Arrowsmith's A Field Guide to the Little People. Okay, not going to give you a lot of information, but it has this massive cultural bibliography, which can let you deep dive on a whole bunch of other topics.
Catherine Briggs. Yeah. She is actually kind of the poster child for.
I said.
studies.
Yeah,
Did you say?
KM
Oh,
Briggs.
you did.
I did. Yeah, KM Briggs on English fairies. Yeah.
Yes.
Unfortunately, mostly out of print, but if you can get your hands on a copy, they are gold. But yeah, with that being said, back to, so you're talking about behavior
Yes.
and fairy, or behavior and function. So I like to call it the fourfold model, which is more fall, which is just a fancy schmancy term for the appearance, inclusive of its any sight, sense, behaviors, etc. And then its behavior, and then the consequences of the interaction with it, specifically the consequences that can actually be traced to the fairy itself, because people will bring up all sorts of other weird consequences that may not have anything to do with it. And then the fourth is going to be its relationship with either the person or the community that tells the story. And that one's maybe not the most important for. Well, that one's an interesting one because that one touches on cultural questions of cultural variation, which aren't as big as a lot of modern academics want you to think, but there are some, and also questions on the relationship of humans culturally and religiously to fairies in whatever region they happen to be in. So, yeah, so I call that the fourfold model. And then, I guess, bearing in mind that we're dealing with things that were believed to be real people, whatever your personal feelings may be on the subject. So, yeah. With that in mind, what can we say? Morphology, like we'll lay aside morphology for the moment because that's going to change depending on which types of beings you're looking at. But what would you want to say about behavior?
So behaviorally, I think um, we can again when it comes to behavior, we have that image of what I'd like to start off with actually is getting into their uh, getting into the meat of their personality and why I think they get so or why fairies get such a bad rap. I think is mainly due to what we might perceive as some of the, like their almost arbitrary hostility towards humans. And I think it's important to point out that fairies are not they're not creatures of darkness. So when we say hostility, what do we mean by that? Well, in a lot of folk stories or tales or stories about fairies, uh, there's always a sense of sometimes there's a sense of dread associated with them or fear because they can be perceived as hostile or aggressive towards any who might be co-inhabiting with them in some nearby mound or pasture or what have you. Um, and one thing I think to note about fairies and their perceived aggressiveness is that it's not arbitrary. Um, they are, in fact, creatures of what we might call social order. I guess a more critical academic might say social control, but I think that term is stupid. Um, they are actually they do moderate and regulate behavior. So they are, in
So,
fact, moral beings.
yeah, so it might then be nice to step back and maybe look at two other features that I think play into that, which is the degree to which a lot of fairies are they're not spirits of the land in the sense of like nature spirits, but
Mhm.
they are tied to physical features
Yes.
um, or places. And so that I think is worth noting that if you look, a lot of what distinguishes types of fairies, if you look at the folklore, is not only questions about their nature or their appearance, but where they live. Um, you have spirits that are associated with a given place and which might become the house spirit if you build on that land, such as the brownie, the domovoi, the hobgoblin. And then you have spirits associated with the underground, with mining, and specifically, this is the Cobley now from Wales, which some of you may recognize as the goblin. Uh, Although, yeah, it has different connotations depending on the language in that case.
Yeah, I
Um,
would actually say, though, that those kinds of behavioral traits reflect more like it does reflect their interaction with the land or the location itself. And I'm not, like, I would say actually, based on, what we've read or, it like the brownie, the cobbly now, and I think the dwarf that lives in the hill over yonder, actually, like they're all technically part of the same species. It's just
yeah,
their
well,
behavior changes within the environment.
yeah. So my point here is simply that their behavior towards humans and their generic behavior is often tied to the piece of whatever they're associated with, like with tree, river, land, on piece something underground, the stables, etc.
Yeah.
Whether or not they're the same species, and that I think is a maybe better grounding for what you talk about with social order. Um, there are sort of untethered fairies that show up to generically punish malfeasance.
Yeah.
Uh, this is a lot of. I cannot remember the endonym for it, but Inuit taboos. Uh,
Okay. Yes. Yeah.
yeah, have to do with the Inuit belief that many of the Inua will punish you if you mistreat. women without husbands or orphans.
Yeah.
Or other people. But those are the two most common in Inuit folklore for the very simple reason that when we look at a semi-nomadic hunting society, you're looking at a lot of dead men with uh,
Yeah.
with the woman and children, or just the children left behind. Like if the woman were out and died too, sometimes a lot of orphans. As a consequence, the orphan has a much larger role in Inuit folklore than elsewhere. But yeah, like there are untethered spirits, but a lot that sort of react to generic misbehavior. The white woman of Germany comes to mind as being especially concerned with sexual impropriety
Hmm.
from men or women, to be clear. Um, you can also, however, often look at specific responses to mistreatment towards whatever the creature is watching over. Um, for instance, the Russian Bannock's particularity over bathhouses, uh, the frequent number of stories that I must have seen from over a dozen countries at this point about how stables went haywire if they were not properly mucked out and cleaned, because it upset the fairies living there. So yeah, that's probably one of the best examples. And then there's we can go a whole host of minor ones. So yeah, maybe those examples better contextualize your remarks about social order.
Yeah. And well, yeah, just also what you see generally, like they do test people and their morality, especially concerning charity. You see that in stories about Swiss dwarves and Irish and Welsh fairies. Generosity, charity, um,
Well,
the ability to, yeah,
yeah, charity, honor.
yes, yes,
That's another one. Sexual propriety, big one that, and then the last one is, I guess, like ritual. Um, I
that's
think one
true.
of the
Well, yeah, well, keeping your dues.
Yeah, keeping your dues. There is one of the interesting things about fairies that sort of pushes at the boundaries of are under the sort of, you talk about social order, social control, is how many of the infractions enforced by fairies were often not things the local community was liable to see as very wrong in and of itself. Um, Fairies in a lot of English fairy stories, although you see this elsewhere, concern somebody who is out working or playing when it's supposed to be a holy day and they're supposed to be either at church or with family, and they are beaned or punished or kidnapped by a passing fairy, um, which then later metastasizes into the devil under Puritanism. See Jeremy Hart's, I think it's Cloven Hooves. Was that what
Yeah,
it was called?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Cloven
Um,
hooves in hill country.
yes, Cloven Hooves in Hill Country. Um, this is all the more not like, obviously there were certain periods in church history where these values were hugely enforced by the clergy, but in general they seem not to have been as important to the laity, and there's often a sense of bewilderment in these stories about why fairies care so much about adherence to the festivals, especially because they weren't believed to be Christian themselves. And this earned this commitment to the law, maybe as a form of order, is one of the reasons why you find so many fairies referred to as Jews. You have the Pharisee in, was it Suffolk County? Uh, yeah, they were called the Pharisees, and I want to say it may have been Somerset. I'm sorry, English people, I may be confusing my counties. And then you have Judela from Germany, the little Jew. just off the two examples off the top of my head. So yeah, just broaden the sort of understanding of order. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to say on that topic.
No.
All right. So yeah, order, very like law-based order. This understanding of ritual or of law shows up extensively in interactions with fairies. So we tend to focus on punishing because negatives have a bigger impact on the human mind, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why are there so few popular narratives in which people have a merry, jolly old time frolicking about?
Well, yeah. Well, negatives make the story.
Yeah, negatives make the story. If you look at the positives, though, you'll know, or even neutrals, such as like borrowing a lot of them have to do with people borrowing stuff, or requesting the services of a human, or offering the services of a fairy cow in Ireland and Scotland. Very strictly administered to the letter of the law.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very stringent. Not these aren't like if your neighbor asks to borrow your cheese grater, you're just going to give him your cheese grater and then he'll give it back to you when he's done. You're not going to prearrange like the hour. Nor are you going to add in legal conditions about like tell no one where you got this cheese grater from. And yeah, not that obviously cheese graters don't show up too much in folklore. They are probably a much more recent invention. But a lot of the pot stories, they show up to emphasize the almost anal retentive emphasis on particularity and order with the Fae.
Yeah. Well, that goes into wider ideas of like stipulations imposed by spiritual beings.
Yeah.
And similar creatures. It's like it's a form of limitation. It is sort of related to the idea of tapu or taboo, tangentially anyway.
Of what? Sorry.
Of like the orders, like the stringent lawmaking. Like
Oh
there's a
yeah.
lot of those involved like don't reveal where you got the source, don't tell anyone where you got the magic strength. It's it's I think that also relates to like the concept of the promise or the oath.
Yeah.
It's it's related to that phenomenon. So it is it's being conscientious of limits and promises.
Which is, I guess, that's the flip side of liminality. We in the West, like fairies are liminal figures, in the strict sense that they are associated with the margins of the human, not like the human mindscape. Basically, they live in the they live in the ruins or at the corners. They show up, but in the twilight and just at like 4 in the like the witching hour is not midnight; it's at like 4 in the morning, right before
3 o'clock, I think.
3 o'clock. Okay,
yeah.
And farming season or farming, if you're a farmer, you'd be out what 4 or 5.
Yeah.
So yeah, they're basically they're out and about and at their most active during the periods. Not least conducive, but most perpendicular or oddly situated relative to human interests. This liminality tends to get noticed by scholars, but in the West, we have a bad habit of assuming that means it breaks boundaries. And actually, in order for something to be truly liminal, it has to be something of the boundaries, which means it has to paradoxically reinforce them.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Well, this shows up a lot in a lot of ancient religions. Remember we talked. So I don't actually know if it's ever come up on this channel, but if you look at the role of the goddess Hecate in late antique in what we call Neoplatonism, which is a horrible name. But if you look at the goddess Hecate in Neoplatonism, Hecate is reified as this liminal figure who adjudicates between the bounds of this world and the bounds of the higher world, the moon. This is ancient cosmic geography, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so this, like, goddess of the crossroads, and which side and it's not so much that you have to transgress the boundaries, but you have to mediate crossing the boundaries, because the peril of Hecate in Neoplatonic thought is depending on how one traverses the boundaries. One can either ascend as a diamond to the moon, or one can remain stuck in the underworld as a demon dog. And both are the same figure, but moving in two different directions. So yeah, bit of an aside there, but I can pick similar examples from other cultures.
Yep.
But yeah. All right. So what next for behaviors of fairies?
So okay, I guess we can try to tether it. What?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, nothing. I guess one thing. So now that we've discussed their morality and their the ways of they go about doing those things, I think it's one important thing to point out to fairies is, I guess, the importance not only of their liminality but also the way in which they, like, the reason I would avoid, like there's this notion in scholarship that fairies are like degenerated gods or humorized gods, and you see that a lot show up in the scholarship, particularly in Irish scholarship, where there's this attempt to try and force an evolution from, let's say, a particular deity. We'll take Lu as an example, the god of light in Irish myth. And there's this trend to later on, like you see the notion of leprechauns, for instance, right? So we'll take leprechauns as a good example of a fairy. Uh, People, academics, they'll look at the way it gets typically described as, let's say, a craftsman, right? Because fairies are artisanal creatures, right? They are associated with the art of the craft, um, at least some of them. And so there's this, we'll try and connect that to the god Lu, who is kind of an all about jack of all trades kind of person. And then we can, through very strange and, quite frankly, dubious thinking and reasoning, we can posit an evolution. Because a lot of people, academics primarily, but this gets trickled down into people who read those works. There's this notion that they are lesser divinities of sorts, and I think one reason not to approach fairies that way is when those evolutions are very forced. They don't actually match up with the general behaviors of the deity. And one thing that makes a fairy, in my opinion, like an actual, the reason why we use that term and not, let's say, lesser god, and we can go into the complexities of the term fairy and its validity, but I actually accept it as a valid term because I think it helps to denote a class of being that is actually not divine or angelic, or whatever term you want to use. The, I guess, Christian version of this is the notion that they're like a type of fallen angel. You see that the clerics had that approach in the medieval age and onwards, that fairies were a special category of angels that weren't evil enough for hell but not good enough for heaven. Um, so there's a lot of those kinds of strange theories and what have you. And I think one thing, like fairies, uh, they have very similar lives to us, though they aren't like us, right? What's what makes them so perplexing in folklore is fairies eat, right? Fairies can drink and eat. They have homes. They make tools and things that they use. They partake in trade or kind of mercantile business with humans, albeit in odd ways. But uh, as we touched on earlier, they do like to trade, right? They trade with us. And the folklore is particularly emphatic on their sameness or closeness to human behavior, but not in a way humans are. And I think like they even have children, right?
Yeah,
Fairies
yeah.
have children, fairies have babies, they have lineage, and they can die, right? They're mortal. Um, Although they can have expanded or extended lifespans, and there's all that business. But fairies are mortal, right? They're very similar to us, which is why there's academics. It can be very confusing because there's on one hand there's a need to say, okay, this is like a rationalization of something. It's like, okay, the church. One example is the church decided to euhemerize the gods, the local deities. Hence why they turned into these little half semi gods or something.
Yeah.
There's the notion that they're ancestor spirits because of their similitude to human behavior, though not quite. Um, that one I think is also very problematic. Then there's the clerical, the act. Well,
Well,
that's kind of hilarious. I think the actual clerical approach to them was, oh, they're just angels of a sort.
well, yeah, I think one of the interesting things that maybe the slight digression here, but I think 2 weeks back we briefly talked about Interpretatio Graeca, uh, and how the Greeks tended to, well, just totally rewrite whatever they came across,
Yeah,
um, to the point where scholars struggle to actually, like in instances where we do have the culture, the records from the culture itself, scholars struggle to match who the Greeks think are talking about to the other culture because of how thoroughly the Greeks would reinterpret things. And I mean, when the Greeks arrived in Egypt and discovered that the Egypt they encountered did not match the mythical Egypt that they admired so much in their own country, they concluded that Egypt had fallen, and replaced the native Egyptian religion with this totally fake, made up Greek Egyptian religion, by bringing in mystery cult experts like Timotheus to like just redesign the temples. The Friedrich Solmsen's Isis in Rome, Roman times, Isis in Rome. Um, the Interpretatio Clerica, Interpretatio Christiana.
I think so. Yeah, I think that's, yeah.
I don't know which one people prefer. Is not marked so much by an emendation of the folklore, but by an aggressive imposition of interpretations.
Yeah,
Right. So Christian clerics they will tell you stories about these beings that are almost identical to the stories that you would get from people who did not think the beings were demonic. And then they will either supply demonic interpretations or explain what the encounter was based on their assumption that the being in question was demonic. We've spoken about this before with Martin Luther's stovetop fairy encounter, where it kept punishing the cooking boy for dirtying the place they were cooking on. But it wasn't doing anything harmful because, the kids just didn't know that he was spreading illness by putting dirty slime right next to the stove. And Martin Luther concludes that therefore demons have no power to kill us. Um, there's a whole bunch of other examples. A lot of the fairy marriage stuff gets reinterpreted by Christians in a different way that it's interpreted, say, in Chinese or Islamic sources. Same goes for beliefs about fairies as treasure finders. That's a consistent one in the grimoires. You can summon or call on fairies to direct you to treasure. There's a funny story about that in Joseph Smith that I won't share at the moment. But yeah. Anywho, yeah, interpretatio. We do have euhemerist narratives from Christians. They just replace them with people. Right. That was the Danish historian, the one Hilda
Snorri.
Davidson. No. I mean, Snorri does it, but there was that other one that Hilda Davidson wasn't too fond of. What was it? History of the Kings of Denmark or something? And the first one is just a very, like, it's just Norse myth, but they're all human kings fighting it out.
Yeah.
Oh, who was he? Oh, who was this? Is okay. Very famous medieval historian, whose name is now, I guess it's like the Gesta Danorum. It was Saxo Grammaticus.
Yes, Saxo. Okay, yes.
Yeah, Saxo Grammaticus, and it's like the first one. Yeah, it's like the first half is just an aggressive rewrite of Norse myth, as if it were a history. Which is like obvious rot, but also very clearly discernible. And again, like totally different from, say, fairy lore, where we're just not encountering that. And then it's another issue, I guess, with the God hypothesis is how astonishingly irrelevant most fairy stories or memories about fairies are to religion. Right.
Yeah.
Like, what's the one from the Landnámabók about? I cannot remember their names, but this one guy is caught trying to seduce another man's wife. So man B is chasing man A, the seducer, with an axe, and they round a corner and see a 200-foot tall giant sitting there, and he's swinging his feet in the water and singing a children's song about how much he likes to play with the pretty waves. And then they just keep running on, trying to kill each other with an axe. Like, they're just like, bye. And that's the story. And it's like, what could this possibly be a euhemerization of? Well, the mythic narrative that informed this particular story, or a lot of the other funny, really funny fairy stories. I think I've said a few on this channel. The one about the two armies that were just fighting for two armies of headless giants who were fighting for 4 weeks straight, and nobody could exorcise them, and they kept sending complaints to the Pope or local bishops, or one of the two. 1526, Germany, mentioned by, I want to say, Le Couteau in Phantom Armies of the Night. But yeah, that's fairies, social order, very, very much concerned with questions of charity, honorable behavior, peace in the household. A lot of fairy stories have to do with the immorality of beating your wife.
Yes.
And again,
not just in Europe. Not just in Europe.
Yes.
That one is universal.
Yeah.
Or
the lore of
social disorder in the household actually is a big one.
Yeah, social disorder in the household often manifests as beatings, which again is interesting because that's not that everyone in antiquity was just off beating their wife all the time, but that it was definitely an idiosyncratic moral view. And this, even if you read the lore of the Ware Wananga, which is one of our only sources on Maori folklore or religion that is written by or recorded by the Maori themselves. They even talk like the Patu. It was not the Patu Pairehi. It was the other one.
Well, Well, it was one of the a similar It was the Turehu.
Yes, the Touré, yeah. After the woman, the fairy maiden marries the man. He beats her. She leaves. He sets off after her, but he can only recover her from her father. Sorry, after promising like not to do it again. Um,
Yeah, and he was the chieftain too. That's in folklore. That is known as or it's related to the king of Elflin's daughter motif,
yeah.
which is
Well,
very common.
yeah. Well,
And
common enough.
also the name
You
of
could
a
write a fiction. Hmm?
oh yeah, and name of a good story.
Yes. They're probably one of the best, actually, probably like pieces of fantasy ever written.
Mhm.
Um, there's a lovely musical adaptation with, I think, Christopher Lee.
Ooh.
I want to say it was Christopher. It was somebody famous in the mid 70s. They recorded it. Um, it's on, if you look it up on YouTube, King of Elflin's Daughter rock album. I'm not going to play it because I don't want to get dinged for copyright. But yeah, peace in the household, social order. I mentioned lots of issues about purity and the law, or paying your dues. Relating to very specific spaces, often liminal. Eat, sleep. And then I think the only other major ones we have to talk about are aristocracy, music, and older than the human race, unless there was
Yes.
anything else.
Oh, and their association with children.
Their association with children, yeah.
Yeah,
All
very
right, yeah.
special. Yeah. So yeah, no fairies. Well, that's what I'd like to get. Fairies, they do love children, or have a special association with children, and
In a
you see that.
Platonic sense.
Yeah, I know. Of course, yes, in a Platonic sense. Yeah, no, they're
Yeah,
not.
well, you never know. People take that one these days. Yeah,
Oh, I know. Oh gosh,
yeah,
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 especially nowadays. Yeah, no,
yeah.
no, they're not YouTubers. Don't worry. Uh, they're or at least, yeah. Um, uh, no, fairies. It's actually a lot to do with the innocence of children and like the pure heart of a child. That is so, I guess, like there's something very fairyian about that value or that kind of
Yeah,
behavior.
that child. Yeah, it's interesting. The fairy tales are for children idea is very. I mean, it's Victorian. Diane, I cannot remember her name, but she wrote Diana Murphy. I want to say Diana Murphy Craddock was one of the bigger ones there. Mind you, her stories are lovely. To be clear, lovely, lovely stories. Even if I cannot remember her name, um, uh, but it does touch on a much older strain of fairy lore that does see a tie between fairies and children. Um, does see.
Well, as an example, in a lot of Native American uh, communities and societies, sometimes children are specially marked as visionaries and almost prophets in a sense, or at least in betweeners for fairies or little people. Um, and there are a few noted special figures of, I forget the name, but there was like I think a Navajo and Cherokee example of some of those people.
Yeah,
You see it also in Hawaiian Menehune lore, which were the little fairy people on the island of Hawaii. They were specially associated with children, and it was said only children can see them. Um, you also have a lot of European fairy tales, and also just sagas and and memorits about fairies or with fairies that are very closely tied with children. Actually, I brought up the example of the Pied Piper last week in our episode on vampires, and the Pied Piper, taking over 200, and that happened, right? That's actually historic.
yes.
That happened, and over 200 children went missing because they were all drawn by the flute of the Pied Piper. And so my opinion on that was that I think that's very Fairy um, behavior. You see all the markers, especially the music, right? The bright clothing, and the mound, right? Like one of the more common abodes of fairies that you see in the folklore is the mound
Yes.
and the mountain, but mostly the mound.
Well, yeah, you see
And
that
this is,
one. Oh,
and I
sorry.
do want to get into that before I let you finish. I do want to get into that. Like there's this confusion amongst academics that because of their association with mounds, then that must mean fairies are like the departed ancestors. Um, because usually a lot of the mounds they inhabit are they are burial mounds, like tumuli. Not always though. That's the thing. That's not always the case. Some are just natural fortifications, or not fortifications, natural landscapes or landmark.
Yeah,
They're part of the landscape. So
yeah.
natural landmarks. So um, that goes more into the metaphysical uh, associations Hales have with the other world than it actually has to do with the ancestors inside. Uh, but we'll come back to that later. So
There
yeah,
is
children. Yeah.
there is a really funny story about the funeral mounds actually in pseudo Aristotle. Because the Greeks had no notion of fairies as residing in mounds. Um, they tend to associate their unique fairy, I guess, geography was satyrs, nymphs, associated mostly with trees, rivers, and mountains to a lesser extent. But they still kept having these stories. So in pseudo Aristotle, there's this hilarious narration about like this funeral mound that keeps having parties at night, and nobody can figure out. It's like people keep going, and it's like the mound will open up and it's empty but full of party goer, but full of like sounds of partying, and nobody knows what's going on there. It's like, okay, thank you, pseudo Eris. I cannot remember. It's in his work on miracle on not miracles, but strange. He has a work on so there's a work attributed to Aristotle on strange phenomena. You can get it from Loeb Classics and in the lesser writings. But yeah, I wanted to say, like, you see the child link. I guess the most I've seen it fleshed out is with in Japan with the kami. It's called
Yes.
kami, like the whole kami kakushi or spirited away um,
Yes.
phenomena. And yeah, that's the name of the well. You see, I mean, the Miyazaki film very fidelitous to that element of Japanese folklore. Uh, Children would be abducted by spirits such often I cannot remember their name for the men who lived in the woods. It might have been Marabito. I might be confusing them with someone else. um, the wild man, the Japanese equivalent of the wild man or woodwoes, or by the tengu on the mountains, and they would sort of return as harbingers of wisdom. And if you look at Japanese rites for I don't want to say for gaining supernatural powers, but that was certainly one of the outcomes. Um, like such as the rites of Shugendo, and I'm drawing here partially from Carmen Blacker, her book The Catalpa Bow, and partially the Parsha Daily Parsha, no, partially from Hitoshi Miyake's Shugendo. But if you look at the Shugendo religion of mountain priests, the whole rite was structured around like regaining that childlike heart through transcending the spheres that kept us from it. And this ends up not equated with, but made part and parcel with Buddhahood. Um,
Interesting.
a lot of the Waiksa figures in Burma have similar features, but we won't. That's not really a fairy. That's something else. So we'll avoid discussing that for the moment. But yeah, like related to it's the childlike heart, the whole complex of, I guess, purity, uh, and especially when you remember that a lot of purity, and then the mischievousness is another thing. Uh,
Yes, mischievous.
Very like the one of the issues with the old fairies are Lovecraftian monsters stereotype is the mischievousness in a lot of fairy tales, especially those having to do with household spirits, um, is the mischievousness of pranks. Right. It's silly jokes, maybe a little taken to extremes, but rather than malefic actions per se. Um, well, tying up hair, messing around with horses, all things that were slightly on the annoying, just slightly enough on the annoying end to be a bother, but not to be actively malicious unless done to excess, which is when people tended to call in the exorcist.
Yeah.
/ perform whatever rite they felt would drive off the spirit. But yeah, the whole mischief. We'll get more into the mischievousness and I think the pure heart, because one of the interesting elements of fairy lore is they're inveterate liars, but much more reliable in their actions.
Yeah.
I guess in contradistinction to human beings, who tend to be very pure of word. If there's any one sentence that could describe humans, pure of word and sin of deed. And then, yeah, I guess the remaining stuff to talk about is going to be, older than the human race. Yeah, do you want to go into that one before we discuss Well, I guess we discussed aristocracy implicitly. Like, you can see how it sort of follows from everything we've said, right?
Yeah, yeah.
If they're obsessed with courtesy and purity and issues of tranquility, as opposed to they're going to be much more formal in behavior.
Yeah.
And this leads to an extensive association between fairies and the aristocratic or ancient dress. You see this in Norway. There's some really funny stories in Yeats about, like Yeats, William B. Yeats, famous poet, a practicing occultist and staunch Irish nationalist. And the Irish nationalist movement, they were all Republicans at the time, in the sense of that they wanted a republic, not in the sense that they had some affiliation with American political parties, in case that was unclear. And yet, like, there's some really funny stories in Yeats where he talks about, like, fairies showing up dressed as English aristocrats. They're just like, yeah, screw you. No republic here, man.
Well, that's funny because Memorits concerning Pegasi. So, like in certain parts of France, near what was it? What mountain range was it? Oh crap!
The Jew. I want to say it was the Jew something. Jew something.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it was the just something. There are records of like a Pegasus like creature. So actually, it wasn't just Greeks that had a notion of a Pegasus. That's actually found in Celtic or at least French folklore. Um, and the I want to find out. Hold on, let me go search for it.
The Jura.
The Jura, yes, the Jura, yes.
It was the Jura, and you
Yes.
cited Traditions populaires comparées by Désiré Monnier when you
Yes.
sent me that.
Yes. And he notes that near the Jura, right, the peasants would see a man. They called him the Sylph Rider or the Sylph, and he would ride on his Pegasus in the mountains. And the peasants, the shepherds, they'd be like, yeah, it's kind of a matter of fact. They'd say matter of factly, like, he just flies around and kind of swoops down and swoops over the lake and hovers above it, and sometimes he'll land and tether his horse, his Pegasus, to a tree or something, and he'll go off and what have you. According to the locals, he was also in the habit of giving people there a ride. Right, he would actually taxi them to other parts of the country, and I think even across the borders, as long as they were pure of heart. So there's another association with purity there. But also, it was actually around the time of the French Revolution, and with the overthrow of the monarchy, that it was said that the angel, or not angel, the fairy Sylph Rider on his Pegasus, he disappeared around that time.
Yeah.
And so the peasants actually associated his disappearance with the destruction of the monarchy. So even in France, there's that implicit notion of fairies having a pro, or at least an aristocratic bent.
Yeah. Well, yeah. There's all sorts of European stories like that. But yeah.
Yes, yeah. There's some in Russia too. Actually, you mentioned with the rise of the Bolsheviks.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and there was in Norway they fought what was it, the 1813 Norway-Sweden War? Well, let me. I believe it was with part of the Napoleonic Wars, right?
Hmm.
And they were fighting against Napoleon, per the Norwegian folklore.
Oh, that's funny.
Well, unless I got that backwards.
I think you were right. Anyway, so that's interesting. Which makes sense. Why they're pro, like they're members, and it's actually reflected in their livery, right? They wear those nice garments, like the bright colors. So one thing in folklore all around the world, and I can say this confidently, all around the world, one of the major sticking points, or one of the major things that pops out to you and says fairy when investigating folklore is the color schemes. They are associated with bright colors, and that can come in the way of green. Green seems to be the most common in like Irish, Welsh, um, British Isles kind of folklore, and Orkneys as well, in the Orkneys. Um, you see blue, you see red, sometimes you see white, pink. There's also gray or black, brown sometimes. That was true in the case of the Isle of Rugen. Um, you see it yellow. Uh, there's blue. I would say red, white and red are the most common colors you see with fairies, but you do see them kind of have that they partake in that color spectrum. Very very bright clothing, right? They're associated with very popping colors, and that was true in the case of the Pied Piper, who wore very multicolored bright clothing. Um, so that is
Wikipedia.
what what.
Wikipedia tells me I got it backwards. Norway was fighting for independence against Sweden as part of the Sixth Coalition.
Oh, I see.
So the Norway was, I guess, implicitly with Napoleon,
Mm.
but mind you, this is Wikipedia. Hopefully, it's accurate on such a ridiculously easily checkable fact. You never know. And sorry about that.
Okay. But
Yeah.
you again, that color schema is practically universal and not just confined to Europe. You also see it in Maori folklore, the Philippines, Afghanistan folklore, and it does exist. Um, you see it actually in North and South America as well. Actually, um, you see it, pretty much Japanese folklore as well. Um, that is something. So that's very common. That is truly universal. So I guess one of the things, and then you get into their size or their shape, where they can be tall. Some of them are short, like the dwarfs. We like that is a real there's controversy surrounding that in academia. Tolkien was especially J.R. Tolkien was especially I guess disgruntled on the notions of fairies being these diminutive little. I don't know if maybe he was railing against the teacup kind of fairy though, in the
He was
Victorian.
railing against the Victorian teacup.
Okay, okay,
And to be fair to him, I think late Victorian fairy depictions, such as it was not Diana Murphy, it was Dina Mulock Craik,
okay.
and then like figures that followed after her, like L. Frank Baum. Sometimes they would just portray the fairy as glitzy, but like yeah, often the fairy becomes exclusively a teacup cutesy figure. Uh, I do think you are. I do think Tolkien maybe took some of his disgruntlement excesses, though, given that a lot of early fairies are only a few inches tall.
Yeah. Oh well, some were as tall as your thumb.
Yeah, that was the Portunes, right?
Well, that was also leprechauns.
Oh yeah,
Some leprechaun, yeah, some like pixies and leprechauns. Like we can, I think we'll save fairy taxonomy for another time. But very very similar in size and shape, and it can range from a few inches to as tall as 6 feet, or like 6'6" in the case of the Patu Payara.
yeah,
Um, of Maori folklore, but the size ranges, and there's like differentiating the fairy types is uh interesting, if not sometimes. Well, that can be a bit challenging, but because they all do have similar values. I mean, I
yeah.
think you'd be able to differentiate like the woodwoes from the dwarf or whatever, and yada
Yeah,
yada.
I
But
think you can reasonably carve out a few very broad categories: woodwows, dwarf, elf,
yeah,
uh, satyr, or well, yes, and then from there it sort of breaks down. Uh, at least if you want to be precise.
yeah,
But yeah, I guess we'll finish up the last two things I think are worth mentioning, and then we will take a brief break before launching into a discussion of what we can tell fairies aren't
yes,
based on this description, or based on the list of features we described. And so, would you want to talk about older than the human race
yes.
first, or associated with music and dance?
Uh, we'll do the older than the human race first. So that is one. So that gets into really identifying what fairies are and are not, because that will impact the way you actually see them and how you relate to them. Because one common trope you do find in fairy folklore, I would say there is almost zero evidence to suggest they are ancestral spirits or spirits of the departed or ghosts in some fashion. Um, Maybe limited evidence in some cases, but in most settings, in most communities that have a notion of fairy folklore or fairy lore or whatever, they are conceived as being pre-human. And what that means is they are mostly, by and large, the original inhabitants of the land. So Manx folklore acknowledges this. It's explicit in Irish folklore or Irish mythology with the Tuatha Dé Danann and their association with fairies and the fairy mounds.
Yeah, the
Um,
Menehune.
the Menehune, the Patupayare. In fact, the Maori didn't even come to New Zealand until the 13th or 14th century.
Yeah, 1300s per
1300s,
their own oral histories. To be
per their
clear,
own
this
oral
is
history. Yes,
not
this is
some
in.
revisionist academic. This is what the Maori say about themselves.
Yes,
Um,
and the Patupayare, which is their they had a few different races on New Zealand before they came, and they did have a variant of like a Bigfoot like creature. It was called the Mero. That one they drove to extinction, unfortunately. But the Patupayare, they
it was
arrived.
Reihi.
Huh?
I thought it was Patupairehi. Sorry.
No, they drove them to the Northern Island. The
No, the
Pachapayari,
name.
yes, that's what I'm getting. The Mero, I said, were the Bigfoot-like creature, the hairy one. That one was
Well,
the Pachapayari are well, they're very very similar to like the she and other fairy-like creatures. Very similar, the exact same creature, I would say.
I
Um,
was just asking about pronunciation.
yeah, yeah. Well, so whatever. So the Pachapayare, they were the original among some of the different tribes. They were the original inhabitants of New Zealand, and then the Maori came and they fought them, and then they drove them, I think, to the north. You also see that with the Korporkur and Ainu folklore. So the Ainu are the what you'd call the indigenous inhabitants of Japan. Um,
North Japan.
yeah, North Japan. Yes, North
Yeah.
Japan. Um, and they have their own very similar fairy tradition. They were called the Korporkur, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. They were little diminutive little fairy people, and they, according to them, they were also the original inhabitants before humans came, before they came. And the Ainu have been there for like thousands of years, so that's interesting. It's also the case in the Norse cosmology and the Norse cosmogony. Actually, the dwarves or the Dwegar were created before humankind. Um, and you also had like I think the notion. So you remember uh, the tradition of like Norse sailors cutting off the head of the prow to not scare the spirits. You know that? I think
Yes.
that also indicates that, like, actually, I think that because they didn't want to scare the landwights, right?
Yes.
Because they held in their mind they're the original inhabitants of the land. I think that actually points to that.
Well, yeah,
Um,
you see that. That's that I think is the most practical or outcome of what we're. The reason we even brought this up is there's a consistent thread. I won't say universal, but certainly global, in the sense that you can find it on every continent, and it's mostly unrelated because it's not like academics of a. As I've mentioned before, that it's weird, like, oh, and then Europeans brought it around. The Europeans were not shipping around a lot of these beliefs because they didn't hold them themselves at the time.
yes.
Certainly not the colonizers at any rate.
The settlers. Oh yeah, no.
But sorry, back to what I was saying. There's this consistent thread of the reason I mentioned earlier that a lot of the time you see the land spirit become the house spirit. There is a consistent thread of when you arrive in an area, you engage in some rite. Its nature changed depending on your attitude to the land, the fairies, the land spirits, whatever. Mollifying, driving away, etc., of claiming the land, and then negotiating a which call contract in the Latin term is in usus or usufruct. So in modern codes of private property, think of it as like you acquire ownership of the land through a purchase, right? Let's say I drop 10,000 an acre. That is now my land. I can do what I want to that land. In more, I want to say traditional, but in societies in which fairy beliefs would come, would be I'd have to purchase the land from a human being. Of course, I can't simply go and take the land. But I'd show up to the land, and then before I could build anything on it or chop it down or use it, I engage in a rite, like acknowledging that the land belongs to the brownie or the whatever spirit, and formally claiming or negotiating, as I said, depending on your personal or cultural view of the being, and then I would begin to construct on the land. But my ownership of the land is conditional upon my treatment of the land, the spirit.
Yeah.
This is the origin of the belief in some circle that the partially true, partially false belief that you often see that fairies are like spirits of nature and animistic cultures were like in tune with the spirits of nature. Blah. That's often not the case. A lot of the time, they were at war with them.
Yeah.
Not always, and not to overgeneralize, of course, but like certainly it's not as uniform and not far from as positive as it often gets presented in modern works. But you do see that negotiated view of property. You might almost think of it as joint ownership. And so
Yeah.
that's why, like, why bring this up is if we're talking about how people have related to fairies and how fairies have related to people, the land element and the land ownership is going to be one of the biggest, if not arguably, I think maybe arguably the biggest.
It does reflect in the folklore, because there are a few
Oh,
examples in Thomas or Jenkin Thomas's book on Welsh fairies, in which farmers they would go and mess up the turf of the fairies that they like to dance on, and then he'd get horribly punished.
yeah.
Right, because that's defiling their space.
Yeah, I just meant if I like. There's a whole bunch of sort of things that we can think of with fairy human encounters, but I think the biggest may be negotiated land contracts.
Yeah.
Just for the rather obvious issues of domestic like relationships, as opposed to why are there less stories about fairies at sea? They exist. Like there were a lot of ships that had their own fairies. And the reason you see less of them is because there were less sailors than there were people living in houses.
Mm-hmm.
big shocker on that one. And also, again, because less people. A folk tale, it can be passed down by there's two groups of people who have a piece of folklore. And so this range from stories to beliefs. There's passive transmitters and active transmitters. Passive transmitters are people who have the belief but don't necessarily spread it. Active transmitters are people who are engaged in spreading the belief. So to give an example here, let's say you have 300 people who all are aware of hiding eggs at Easter for children to hunt. Like that's a folk custom, right?
Yeah.
First attested in the Ukraine in the 1650s, or what is now the Ukraine, comes west, or maybe it existed in the West all the time. It's always hard to tell when it comes to folk beliefs. At any rate, about 400 years old. And so if you're looking at a village, most people know that belief, but they're not actively transmitting it to anyone, except maybe at Easter when they switch from being passive to active transmitters. This means that folklore tends to favor stories that people are more likely to pass on, right? And it also tends to favor stories around like areas where people are more likely to tell tales, which is going to be the household, right? Mm-hmm. You're an illiterate, or maybe not illiterate, but like semi-literate family. You tell tales at dinner time. There's even lots of like some photographs of large tale telling sessions in a number of places from between like just at the start of modernity, where you had people with cameras, but not a lot of people still weren't quite sure about what they were. As opposed to the people side, as opposed to stories about the mines or ships, which are just less likely to be told. This does, however, I guess you mentioned the fairy's favorite dancing turf, and I guess this does lead into the last thing we should probably discuss, which is fairies and music and dance.
Yes. Yeah, by far one of the more, I think, at the core of fairy lore really is their penchant for music. And I guess it's one of my 3 ways to identify really what's a fairy is, the color scheme, the shape of their body, the general behavior, and the music. Right? So music is sort of ubiquitous in fairy lore. You can't really escape it. And typically this association with music, like it's very ethereal enchanting. It entraps you, and it's
Very simple too.
very simple too. Yes, very
Yes,
simple. Very ritualistic as well.
yes. It's one of the so there are several compositions that have survived which purport to be from fairies themselves. The Guangling Song is the most famous example. It was famously given to, say his name was Juan Qi, Jian Qi, um, second century sage of the Bamboo Grove. Um, yeah, yeah, Jian. In about the third century, fourth century, um, third century CE, and it was I confused two of them. Sorry, Kong. Um, Kong purportedly received the Guangling Song from a giant. The exact narrative is in, or a giant figure. Sorry, I should say, maybe not a giant himself, who played music for the Yellow Emperor as thanks for a favor he did to the spirit's bones. The full story can be found in Robert Ford Campany's Tales of the Marvelous, Marvels of China. Uh, A Garden of Marvels, my apologies. Robert Ford Campany's A Garden of Marvels, which is one of the better collections of Chinese jigwai, or strange tales in English. There's also another famous example from the Selkies. That's you can find the full text in the back of Dave Thompson's The People of the Sea. And then there's one more example from England that is just presently escaping me. And, ethereal and haunting certainly describes it. But above all else, you see a sort of stylistic purity and fluidity.
Yeah.
Interestingly, you also see this in Hesiod, if any of you have ever listened to his poems put to music, or sung. Which is fascinating when you remember that Hesiod, alone of the poets, claimed to be directly acting under the influence of the muses. It's a famous. Does he put that narrative at the start of his Theogony or the start of his Works and Days?
I don't remember, but Homer said something similar, though, right?
Did he?
Where he called on the muses.
No, but Hesiod claimed to have been possessed by them.
Oh.
As opposed to an exhortation. What's interesting about because you have a lot of poets claim to muses heed my obviously you're going to pray to the nymphs of music, right? If you're trying to do a musical composition, not a hard one there. Hesiod, however, claims to be acting under divine influence.
Okay.
Which is one of the more interesting features of ancient Greek religion. Divine influence from fairy maidens. But yeah, consistent association with music tends to be simple, tends to be ritualistic, especially in connection to the relationships between fairies and people over time. A lot of music is often present at those rites. Admittedly, that's not unique to human fairy. That's music is present at most people's religious rites. But certainly, like humans and fairies, Confucius was this was one of the reasons he was so insistent on proper musical harmony. And Mencius and Junji after him was the Confucian belief that you would not be able to rectify the relationship between the ruler and the spirits of grain and land, as they call, if you did not adhere to the proper tonal form in your musical compositions. Remembering here that Confucius claim to be able to see the fairies. To see the spirits. But yeah, I think that's all the features of fairies, or the list of features we can assign to them. We have a list of about 20, although we, I think, brought it down to about 10. Do you want to break for a minute or just proceed straight into what fairies aren't?
Yeah, we can break. Oh, I do want to touch on the fact a few. Well, we can maybe bring it up sometime in the conversation, like their association with aesthetics.
Oh yeah, that can come up. That'll come up implicitly.
Okay.
So we will take we'll get to take a 2-minute break.
Yeah.
Because we've been going for an hour and a half. So, and then we will come back to discuss some things fairies aren't. And we'll probably have to call it there and do a second one on what fairies are.
Yes.
Next week. So, anyway, we'll be back about 10:38.
All right. Yeah.
EST. Mm-hmm. Alrighty. Just wait for Ryan to get back and then we will go. Mm-hmm.
All right. I am back.
Alrighty. So, throughout history, people have they've either tried to rationalize fairies by, making beliefs about them more compatible to their own personal views, or to provide some explanation for fairies, which isn't maybe rationalistic, but still tries to fit them to their views. And this has led to a number of very strange very strange interpretations of fairies. I don't know which one you wanted. We've spoken about a couple examples so far. Euhemerized gods uh, is that was one of the most popular ones from the Victorian era. You still see that one today. Thankfully, not in academia, but I do find it occasionally on the internet. Um, I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to say about that one, or if
Well, um, I think it's stupid, and
well, okay.
given well, given the sheer ubiquity of common fairy behavior across all cultures, that one can be pretty much ruled out.
Yeah, that can be. I mean, yeah, common behavior. Um, Most cultures that have a fairy lore and are polytheistic distinguish the two.
Yes.
Um, and if they don't, that's simply because they see there as being some continuity of spirits. But even then, you usually see a difference between like the spirit of the ice flow or whatever, who's just his job in life is just to watch that ice flow. Um, he's just there. He's just watching the ice flow. Versus, say, the god of the moon. uh, just for maybe reasons that should strike us as intuitively obvious. uh, but yeah, in basically every culture where we encounter fairies and gods, or one continuity of spirits, we do see a sort of internal division. Um, and most of the animists I've met active nowadays are, even if that division isn't emic, which is to say intrinsic to their own religion, they're happy to concede it in practice uh, because of the obvious discrepancy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, and then there's little to no evidence of euhemerization, compounded by the fact that, as we said, like the features are very consistent. Um, we did not go into Islamic fairy lore. It just didn't come up. But I will simply note here that it is very interesting to the point of rather obvious. That like the beliefs about fairies and Christian that or in the Christian world or medieval Europe, sorry, and the beliefs that you find in records of Islamic fairy lore. Uh, Amir El Zain, was Islam Arabs in the Intelligent World of the Jinn?
Yeah, I think so.
Uh, yeah, some issues with that book, mostly because she has really weird views on the Bible. But pretty good overview on Islamic fairy lore and beliefs about jinn. Um, it's almost identical to Christian beliefs. Same with if you read, there aren't many good books on Jewish fairy lore, and you're looking at an essay. Same there though, and then same China, and very little on India, but everything I have read is the same. Um, like gods and demons of India, you have the same set of features. Uh, so that's a book by Bhairav. It not, and then there's another. Actually, there's one I don't want to cite because I haven't finished it yet, but it's on Dakini's fairy like in Buddhism, but again, same depiction there. So just for that alone, there's little reason to think that we should ascribe divinity in the way that we might to Thor to fairies.
Yeah.
And then just, I guess, to recap, there also the fact that most fairy lore has little to nothing to do with the set of things we might ascribe to the divine, just by virtue of its religious irrelevance.
Yeah.
Or
Well, actually, there's a good amongst certain Germanic. Oh, I can't remember. Um, I think it was. Let me find it here. Thomas Keightley did bring up a few examples of I think German dwarves, or somewhere in the Germanic sphere, Germanosphere, of the peasants actually still acknowledging or having an awareness of gods like Thor and Odin, but distinguishing them from like the dwarves, and even insisting that like dwarves and like gods like Thor are like have some like mutual animosity towards each other, because apparently the trolls in one of those regions all have collective trauma over Thor's thunder and his hammer, because he would just
Mm.
attack them. So even when
Expensive.
there actually is a religious, they do distinguish.
Well, yeah, that was the Aztecs too, and the Neoplatonists. But in their case, I think the hierarchy. Well, so the Neoplatonists were famed for setting up this massive, very, very, very complex hierarchy of divine beings going all the way to man. Um, and they make a distinction. In their case, it's very what's the right word? They conflate was it satyrs and nymphs with diamonds, like guardians.
Yeah.
That is mostly arbitrary and intended more to satisfy their theological concerns. Uh, we know we have a decent amount on the religious role of satyrs. Like they were in fact pretty important, but they were not important as daimons. They were important as as weird as it sounds, they were paradigms of Orphic initiates in a lot of in at least in our surviving Orphic records. Um, I think it's and in some of the other mystery cults. I want to say it's the temple at Samothrace that famously showed the initiates as satyrs. No, I might be conflating two things. I might like the temple at Samothrace with the one in Phrygia. Showed the initiates as satyrs becoming heroes. Uh, I might be conflating two different murals there. The Samothrace one definitely showed the initiates becoming heroes, remembering that heroes were divine in ancient Greece. And it might have been the Anatolian one that showed them as satyrs. But we see that in the Orphic hymns too. Um, so yeah, can make a distinction pretty much between what we call gods and fairies. Uh, which one did you want to talk about next?
Let's see.
Romantic nonsense. Well, I think we knocked the dead out. I don't think we have to revisit that. It's
Yeah,
just there's
no,
no evidence.
no, there's no evidence.
Uh, Dirt.
Mostly this comes from uh, conflating the mounds with like the mounds themselves with, or sorry, the fairies with the bodies of in the mounds themselves, but that's not actually what's going on.
Yeah, yeah.
Anyway,
Well, plus some ambiguous cases from the Norse, but they don't replicate. At best, they don't replicate, and at worst, they're just not there.
oh
Um,
yeah, oh yeah, yeah, that one's more ambiguous. But yeah, I think I also think we touched on nature spirits. That's a bit too reductive and doesn't really like what does that even mean, nature spirit?
well, so there's a consistent belief that tends to be associated with I guess, the New Age, that fairies are spirits of nature. Um, they like and that they represent the processes of nature.
Ah,
Um,
yes, okay.
so New Age writers, David Tame was one of the best chroniclers of this. His Real Fairies records 9 different New Age schools of thought on this. Uh, but I think Brian Froud. Well, I don't want to lump. Maybe I don't want to lump. Brian Froud is sort of adjacent to this, but to give him credit, he I think sees the problem. Um, and but a lot of New Age gurus in the 70s saw natural processes as being driven by fairies. Um, And as Ryan said, the issue with this view is, so to give one example, there's a famous, Dave Tame cites fairies dancing in a ring as them controlling the cycle of seasons, or the cycle of growth, moving energy around. And as Ryan said, the problem with this thesis is simply that it's ridiculously reductive. There are consistent associations between fairies and nature, or features, but it's mostly fairies and features of nature rather than nature itself.
I agree. Yeah.
And fairies tend to have much broader personalities and beings in the folklore and in religious ritual, and in archaeology than simply being, in some sense, coterminous with nature itself. And much of the misunderstanding here stems from the Victorian insistence that belief in spirits was just people who were too stupid to do science. For like that was it. Like it was, oh, they looked and saw thunder and they were like, wow, this is real mysterious. So they assumed it must be the thunder spirit chucking thunder around. This
Well, yeah,
this
religion is proto-science. Yeah,
sorry.
religion is proto-science.
Yeah, religion is proto-science. This view would, in spite of the amount of like hold this view still has over like the public, it had collapsed in the '60s because there is far too much evidence that people who were precisely aware of how natural processes, like maybe they didn't know the what was going on at the microscopic level, but they were able to tell empirically what was going on. And they still believed in fairies or gods or other spirits, pick what thou wilt, as additional causes, the driving agent of physical change. So Seneca, to quote Seneca on the Etruscan, or paraphrase Seneca on the Etruscans, we look at lightning and see the action of what's the scientific explanation for lightning again? The action of the clouds on the earth.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I know that's a wrong explanation, but that is what Seneca says. So, action of clouds on the earth. The Etruscans look on lightning and see Zeus sending a message through the clouds upon the earth. So the difference here is not a question of mechanical interpretation, it's a question of imputation of agency. And for those who think that this is a dispute, say, about empirical reality, I would just like to politely remind you that philosophers can and have done the exact same thing with people, where they observe that since we can explain human behavior through physical processes, we shouldn't have any reason to imply agency. This is the bedrock argument of eliminative materialism. So this isn't necessarily an issue of access to science. Like most of us have access to much better science than they did in late antiquity, and yet most of us are not inclined to say that our fellow man is merely chemicals in a vat. Just to what would you call it, complexify, problematize our understanding of religious motivations in late antiquity. Yeah, that he is merely mortal. But yeah, as I said, that was the sort of Victorian view. It died off, but it inspired the corollary view that fairies were nature spirits, which, as we said, is mostly just too reductive to stand.
Yeah.
The related...
I guess that kind of... Oh, I was going to get into the next item on the list.
Yeah, I was going to switch to elementals.
Oh, me too.
Yeah.
That's a close second to nature spirit. I think that mostly deals like with the Paracelsian model.
Yeah.
Which I would concede is just incorrect.
Yeah, that was just a scientific attempt to explain the supernatural world. Paracelsus was a 16th century chemist a very famous physician in his own time, also wrote extensively on religious topics. And after his death, his followers, I want to say they created a religious school, I think in some respects. They continued his own reflections on religion, but he subdivided the spirit world, or the world of, I guess, neutral spirits, into 4 groups based around the 4 elements, as the 16th century, and saw fairies as elemental husks that administered these elements and would pass on at some point or another into soulless husks. This is a very, it sort of comes out of nowhere. I think that's the main issue. I don't know if they
Well, I don't know. I mean, he looks at their geographical, or I don't know, proximity to certain elements, and it's like, elemental. Like the Undines or Undines and gnomes. It's like they live in the earth and are associated with metals or live in water. Science.
Yeah, I think the like, you still see this account active in occult circles today, and that wasn't a pejorative. I mean, people who actually call themselves occultists.
What's predominant?
Hmm?
It's almost
Sorry?
predominant. I said
Yeah.
it's almost predominant. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's the main issue is just it just comes out of nowhere and has almost nothing to do with any recorded encounters. To the extent it may as well be describing a totally different group of beings. So that's what, 1, 2, 3, 4.
I guess we can go into their racial memories, or an earlier forgotten anthropological group.
Yeah.
Which
that
comes mostly to dead ancestors, though not quite. That one was also very popular in the Victorian era, and that one a little more racial in tone.
a little.
And in some cases was used to drive home certain racist sentiments against other groups. Sometimes that one is also wrong for many reasons. For the obvious reason, again, fairy behavioral ubiquity. They can't,
in its purely anthropological form, it just rubs up against the fact that, like, these are not encounters of beings our great ancestors knew, but we don't. Maybe nowadays, but if we're looking at the old record, like the first person records, they're encounters with people who often claim to have seen the bee creatures, which inspired the view mostly held by like Victorian and interwar race theorists. And I think I've seen a couple figures try it, like Janet Board tries to defend it if you ever read her Real Fairies, which is an interesting, if very idiosyncratic, collection of more recent fairy encounters. And the view that fairies are not, it's what you call like psychological hallucinations of beings our ancestors believed in, or of like ancient Atlanteans. That's not Board's thesis, but that is the. There's a really weird book that has had an annoying amount of influence, whose name presently escapes me, which argues for an international Atlantean pygmy empire.
Oh yes, that one.
That one.
I know that one. I know that one.
Yeah, the alternative archaeology scene, man.
Oh yeah. Oh.
And it's basically taking a look at all the stuff we looked at and then going, but obviously this is some ancient civilization that people like passed on in their memories, or hallucinated. And the first theory just fails because, like, again, we're not dealing with ancient records here. You can sometimes pull that argument off with like mythological cycles, because nobody saw Thor and slug it out with the giant Joachim Holmum. I just made that up. I can't remember the names of the giants he fought offhand. It doesn't. It's not going to fly with fairy lore.
Yeah.
And then the hallucination argument is, I mean, obviously it relies mostly on scientific theories that are no longer acceptable. To the point, and have little, like, even if you're inclined towards fringe science, there's just, I've never seen any evidence in favor of this particular view. It was just something people decided on. Robert E. Howard has some absolutely amazing fantasy stories based around the idea, for the record. If you read his horror stories or his miscellaneous fiction, this was the guy who did Conan the Barbarian. But I think the other issue is it entails the beliefs about fairies are so strong that they have been able to survive and impinge themselves in places where beliefs about real entities just haven't. Like, nobody has hallucinations of mammoths, and yet the mammoth was far more integral to our ancestors' survival than diminutive dwarf people living in the hills. So it just entails just a very bizarre view of human psychology. That one is mostly dead. Though the way 2024 is going, I expect we'll see an imminent revival. Probably on Twitter. People absolutely insisting this is 100% factual. Yeah, I think that.
Yeah, so I guess the other one, so demons or fallen angels.
Yeah.
So this one
And
is
we
more
can
in the
maybe
context
lump
of,
Nephilim into that.
yeah, like, oh, well, yeah, similar, although, yeah, they're similar. So this one is more in the context of Christian theological opinions uh, on fairies, and I guess for a lot of reasons we described earlier, you'd be very hard pressed, I think, even as a Christian, um, to even remotely think these are demons, particularly because of, like, I mean, like, if your definition of demon, like Christian theo, like, it will depend on your tradition, but if it is something purely malignant, adversarial to mankind, and seeks, I don't know, the undermining of all religious life everywhere, or I don't know, that's not what you're going to get with fairies. That's not fairydom. I think there are massive behavioral differences, um, massive differences in intent, and given some of the more particular details about fairies, I think I don't know, it's just, I would almost say wishful theological thinking, but I just think it's just
It's an a priori.
yeah, it is a prior, like, a very uncharitable.
Yes, a priori meaning before experience.
Yeah.
And then it interprets events after the fact to fit that thesis,
Yeah.
basically. It's not consonant with intellectual charity. It's not consonant with intellectual honor, which is treating other beliefs with the same weight you treat your own. And it tends to suffer from the principle of retortion because it's very difficult to justify that view. So, principle of retortion is going to be, can what you say destroy yourself? Or your own view, sorry. And the problem with that is, like, if I flip it around, can I make the same argument work? Yes, probably, almost certainly in many cases. I'm not going to say anything here for just to be respectful, but you can flip it. People have done so. It's one of those, like, lean on the hypothetical. Or sorry, Like you flip it around, and it just gets nowhere because you're just accusing people of demons. And if any Christians are listening to this, I just think it's I just think it's irrelevant and unnecessary. It's not a challenge to any of the major claims of Christian religiosity for fairies to just be whatever fairies are.
I mean, if it is, then
Yeah, if it is,
your
it's a
religion's just
major issue
wrong. I'm sorry, your religion's just
for
wrong.
Christians. But like Judaism and Islam both have a category of neutral spirits. Uh, it's never been a major theological issue to either group. Um, Buddhism has its own like category, and they also like all these religions also believe in demons as a separate category. It is never you have not seen Jews converting to different religions or because of the troubles with fairy lore, or Muslims. Yeah, if you bring up Islamic books on the subject, it does tend to be, it's an issue in Christianity, but it shouldn't be.
Yes, it is. Yeah, I'd agree.
Yeah, the major theological premises of Christianity have nothing to do with the identity of gnomes in the woods. And without getting too off target here, I actually think you can make Christianity stronger by not hating fairies because it explains certain passages in Corinthians. But moving on, that's
yeah.
Yeah, the Nephilim hypothesis tends to be the what would call like the middle way of clerics. They want to assert, they don't want to depart. I don't want to say orthodox because interestingly, like nobody's ever been able to find me a major Christian conclave declaring that fairies are demons. It's this extraordinarily widespread view that, as far as I'm aware, has never been ratified by any church body. But yeah, the mainstream will say view, and so if they're familiar with the folklore and they want to remain more fidelitous to the folklore and to the folk beliefs of the Christian peasantry, who saw no disconnect between belief in harmless gnomes out in the woods and the tenets of the Christian faith. They would often adopt the view that fairies were either the descendants of the Nephilim or the Nephilim themselves, or a category of, so the war in heaven, there's the angels who side with God, there's the angels who side against God. You also have a group of angels who just made no decision, and they tend to get chucked out. And then they get chucked out at the end of the war. But unlike the angels who side against God, who are sent to hell, the ones who made no decision are sent to earth. I mean, I think this view is wrong. I also don't think I also don't think it matters too much. Unlike some of the other views on this list would have very definite blinding consequences. Like if you see fairies as elementals, you're just dismissing 90% of fairy lore. Whereas the middle angel view is just, I guess, just sort of whatever. I don't know. I know you feel more passionately on this than I do, so I don't know if you want to take the reins here.
Yeah, I understand the context behind it and why the clerics. I mean, to be fair, that's what I'd call a more generally a charitable view towards fairies, like especially Irish clerics. I mean, I still don't agree with it, but like Irish clerics, it is funny they did regularly have to kind of deal with this folklore, and it kind of freaked them out a little. Eddie Lenahan brings up some very funny examples of that. And it was something, like they did trust, like, to give credit to like Christians, they did trust their senses a little more, closely than maybe some other groups would have, and they did not wholesale condemn them as demons, but
Or
following
deny
through,
that.
or deny their existence. Like Christians generally did not actually deny their existence.
Yeah.
They did accept the validity of these experiences. Luckily, some were a little more neutral and just more, they didn't really have an opinion. I think Gerald of Wales, when he was confronted with the legend of Eladir, he was an archbishop from Wales during in the 1200s, I think, and he kind of goes around detailing the history of the British Isles at that time, and he was confronted with a story about a young man named Eladir who kind of got whisked away, or actually was invited to like fairyland by a bunch of pygmy people.
Yeah.
With
Married with the queen.
yeah, no, the king. There was the king. There was no queen.
He
But
did
anyway,
marry a fairy maiden, though, did he not?
no, because what happened is, and he was the principal witness because he partook. He told Gerald that when he was young and he was playing with the fairies one day in fairyland, he saw that they had so much gold, and he took a golden ball and stole it and took it back to Earth. And then the fairies were kind of hot on his trail, and then they took the golden ball back, and he was never able to return to fairyland again.
Oh, okay. I'm different Elidor.
Yeah, different. Yeah, no.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
there is the one where he marries the fairy maiden and goes back to King Arthur's court, and then he argues with the ladies in the court, and decides he's had enough of court life and goes back to fairyland.
Yeah, not that Elidor. This different guy. He's not part of the King Arthur cycle. Anyway.
Yeah.
So when Gerald was confronted with this, he was like, "Huh, well, that's interesting." He notes he did a bit of little comparative linguistics. The pygmies are, and they're called the Elilon in Welsh folklore. Um, they spoke a language that was not unlike Greek, and when he was given some examples of their language, he did a little bit of comparative linguistics, and he's like, yeah, this is similar to Greek and Welsh, and so maybe Indo-European, but he did not have any major opinions on this event. And remember, he was an archbishop, so he was part of the clergy, like a very high up member. And he was like, for the sake of my reputation, I'm not going to accept it, but I'm also not going to deny it either, because that would be putting a limit on God's creative acts, which is sort of a sentiment you see kind of reinstated in like ideas like the what do you call it, the principle of plenitude in the church, where like the heavens and the cosmos are filled with all sorts of stuff.
Well, that was a very
sorry?
That was very in Jewish disputes, and that was why the fairies are demons party never got very far in Judaism. They were just accused of heresy and tossed out.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's, and then there were some other later Icelandic bishops and theologians that also attempted to enumerate a theology surrounding fairies, and some were actually, I think, even some members of the church hierarchy at that time claimed to have been their descendants too. So for Christian, it's complex. A complex relationship. So even within church history, there's no outright demonification or demonization of the fairies for obvious reasons, which that's welcoming. But
well, I think, and then part of the problem is people. I think the situation gets especially complex if we start treating the Christian laity as expressing an actual form of like Christian theological discourse, which I know sounds a little weird, but if you look at trial records, throughout the early modern period, you'll find peasants did argue about the identity of fairies, certain other spirit beings, with Christian, not Christian, with like church inquisitors or juries, and did defend on scriptural grounds their right to associate,
Mhm.
or the claim that such entities were not evil. And academics tend to treat this. One of the bigger influences on academic studies of folklore has been Antonio Gramsci, a Italian Marxist theorist who was obsessed with this theory of hegemonies and counter hegemonies. Academics have tended to treat these professions of Christian faith by the accused as fronts to undermine the Christian hegemony with their own fairy hegemony from within. But there's very little reason to think these people weren't being completely sincere.
Mhm.
Some of them were even indignant, and they just went at it hammer and tongs involving several cases involving the Benandonti and some of the Scottish witch trials.
Well, I think
And
Theus of Livonia.
yeah, that one was a
uh,
werewolf case.
Yeah,
but
he was like he mouthed off to the priest. He's like,
yeah,
"You don't know what you're talking about. Shut up."
yeah, there's reason you can disagree, of course, but there's no reason to think they weren't being sincere. And I think that very much complicates medieval or early modern understandings of Christianity and fairies. And Kitely includes several encounters with fairies where the fairies bemoan the fact that they can't find priests to baptize them.
Well, one thing I want to touch on actually is the changeling motif and how that's been sorely misunderstood. Because there's the notion there where like the unbaptized child is at risk of like a fairy kidnapping and then being replaced with like a changeling. Um, that like there's the modern, or I guess the current. I don't know how current it is. Hopefully, I hope it's died off some. But there is the prevailing thought that changelings in fairy folklore are like autistic children that people did not understand and so regularly abused
Yeah,
because they're just cruel and stupid and evil.
that's way actually. I hate to tell you, that's even more prevalent now
Oh yeah, but,
because the disability advocates have got their hands into it.
oh great.
So
Um, yeah, so that theory is wrong. That is stupid.
yeah,
Because anyone who actually looks at changeling folklore a little more honestly will note that changelings are very much attuned to the general behavioral patterns of fairies. And what these kind of, I guess more skeptical or just really just cynically minded people, they'll point to the parts in the folklore where they're like, they don't understand situations, or they'll do weird acts like counting grains or something like that, or just being dumb, or they're just kind of like
well,
stupid and invalids or something like that.
the I mean, the main problem is it's a consistent set of features with no known medical condition that ascribes to it.
Yeah.
Like I mentioned earlier, Tor Bringsvard and phantoms and fairies in Norwegian folklore. They go out and say that it was a dozen different diseases simultaneously. It was changeling stories emerged from people who had like autism and Down syndrome and 4 other diseases all at the same time, which is obviously a statistical implausibility. And also, another issue that, if you look at medical treatises from the medieval era, they may not have had our ability to diagnose and cure, but they, as some of these people seem to think. And there are almost I have quite a few like translations of actual manuscripts, and none of them mention changelings as an example of birth defects. Like it didn't even come up in the medieval mind. They saw them as two totally different, which isn't, of course, to justify any of what went on. Simply to say that I think the popular academic inscription is too hasty.
Yeah. But getting into that point, so the changeling.
Yeah, thanks for coming in, Vihar.
Yeah. So one point I want to get across with the changeling, and how it relates to Christianity, or how fairies typically try to relate to Christianity, is that the changeling motif, what it actually is, or what it's typically associated with, is two things. One, it is like a fairy mother, usually, who is testing a household for the way they treat their child. So it is related to the generosity act, because there are variants of the story in which someone might attempt to get rid of the changeling. So they'll perform some ritual where they'll like put an eggshell in front of it and do something with it. And then all of a sudden the changeling will gain some intelligence, and it'll be like, of all the things I've seen, I've never seen anything like that. And then it might leave. But there are also other cases where the mother, knowing that's not her child, will attempt to kill it or pretend to.
Which would be what we don't endorse.
No. But
Yeah,
there are
let's be
stories.
very clear here.
Yes. But there are stories in which the actual fairy mother will suddenly return with the human child in hand, and she will take back her child and then kind of scold the human mother for not having taken care of her child, and pointing out that she was a much better parent to the human child than the human mother was to hers. Because the child is not actually in danger, so to speak. It is still healthy and fit. It's more, again, it relates to the way fairies do test mortals. But second, there is also the added element of the sort of unbaptized child or unchristened child who is at risk of being stolen away and replaced with a changeling. And that's usually, there are examples in Iceland where that's actually done for the purpose or the purposes of baptism.
Yeah.
Because the fairies actually do want their child baptized, which is a form of spirit consecration. And they are, in fact, trying to partake in the community.
Yeah, the Hulda folk did this too, but through marriage.
Yeah.
They would pursue marriage because it would mean that it was a way for them to get baptized.
Oh, very interesting. Yes.
Yes.
Icelandic elves and dwarves would attempt to do this. And so that was just a way, a tricksy way of trying to associate the fairy child and the fairy community at large into the local human community. So it's much less nefarious or sinister than we might think. And and has nothing to do with autism.
Yeah. Again, not to justify any of what went on, of course, just to state that they leap to a wrong conclusion, and then in this one, it's especially annoying because they'll obviously beating an autistic child is horrible. I don't know who needs to be told that, but that's a moral fact. And especially, and so they'll then leap to emotional manipulation, and they're like, "Well, you're denying this account," and it's like, "No, I'm just denying it because it doesn't fit, not because I favor beating children, because I don't. It's just factually inaccurate.
Yeah, it's just incorrect.
Yeah, what hot take? Beating children is bad,
regardless if they're human or fairies.
Yes, regardless of their identity, and how and whether or not they are autistic or otherwise. Just a procedural dispute.
Yeah.
So I think we're going to have to do 2 sessions here because we are not going to have time to cover the positive view of fairies unless we go to like 1 in the morning, which I don't want to do. But I do think we will have time. Like the last one we would have to discuss. I think we can gloss over romantic nonsense because nobody here is probably into academia enough to get that.
Right.
Last one's just aliens or entities of light.
Yeah, we should touch on that one. There's usually like typically equivocation between fairies and aliens and sort of comparisons to alien contactee movements and phenomenon in the 20th century, and people trying to backpedal that to fairies, and also people like we'll call them ancient aliens theorists, rewriting and revising everything as an alien encounter as much as possible.
There was a sphere. That makes it an alien.
It's from the other world, aka another planet.
Yes. These are real arguments for the record.
Yes, they are. I think given what we've discussed with fairies so far, like again, alien can be a very vague term, very imprecise term. If you want to be super uber technical about it, I guess they constitute as alien, at least to us, because they do kind of have their own realm of whatever, their own other world where they inhabit. But they are also not, because they do originally belong to the land. So in many ways, they're actually not alien. We are the aliens in comparison. So and it's just there's nothing mechanical or rationalistic about what like it's not you could probably make a better case, but
the mechanical one, I a lot of ancient aliens theory, like that. To be fair, totally fair, if you're really into ancient aliens, you can argue that like the ancient aliens have technology so advanced it appears indistinguishable from magical forces with no technology at all. Which is, to be fair, is a like it's a sound or rational argument. I think the main issue is at that point you're just supplying a scientific explanation for a religious phenomena. You're just saying it's miracle working, but with like completely unfathomable scientific technology going on in the background, right? What's your reason for positing that? Well, your reason is, in the words of Giorgio Tsoukalos, because magic isn't real. This is like you talk about the problem with sort of rationalist interpretations or additions. It's like it just goes in any direction you want, right? We can say they don't exist, or we can say they're space aliens. I think the bigger issue is the extent to which alien encounters just don't model fairy encounters. They have some features in common, but they tend to be the more, I don't want to say mundane, like balls of light in the sky have been reported like throughout all of history and ascribed to an uncountable number of causes, like fairies, ghosts, witches, foxes in Japan or China, spirits of the waters. The more scientific explanations, quote unquote, such as like ball lightning or what, are just recent endeavors to explain the same phenomena. But this is not a specifically fairy issue. This is just something humans see, and they're like, oh, just balls of light whizzing around. And maybe sometimes they take form in the folklore. What was the one about it smashed its way into the church and took the shape of a demon, and then they had to exorcise it? And somebody is like, look at how they adapted ball lightning. And I'm like, wait, what? It's like, probably not ball. I don't know. He's like, it was it was ball lightning causing a spontaneous gas mass hallucination. That was the argument for that one. And it was like, okay, buddy. The other features usually, so a lot of info on aliens comes from people in hypnotized states, and it's memory retrieval. And those of you with some knowledge of hypnosis are grimacing right now, not because hypnosis is useless, but because there is an abundance of evidence going back 2 centuries that people in hypnotized states can successfully recall, quote unquote, literally anything, from past life experiences as Theseus to journeys they took to the planet Jupiter to meet, was it Mozart and Zoroaster? Or was it Beethoven and Zoroaster? This was Victorien Sardou, a famous architect with some very unusual esoteric pursuits, which just makes, not to say that there's no value in such information, but the value in such information is going to be psychological rather than empirical, right? Because people will sometimes accidentally implant memories. This has been a very consistent issue with hypnosis for centuries now. It's why the early parapsychologists did not trust hypnosis or hypnotic memory retrieval. And you're welcome, of course, not to like parapsychology, but if parapsychology is wrong and they're saying this doesn't have evidence, presumably you would think it would be even more wrong than if you were willing to trust parapsychologists. But even amongst info about aliens where it's not from hypnosis, it just has very little in common with fairy encounters. We're probably going to do a video or two on aliens in September. I know somebody was asking about Miguel Serrano. It's been a couple of years since I read Serrano on aliens, but I think it would be interesting to discuss just for the sake of history, right? Not for sake of defending anyone. But yeah, discuss ancient aliens, and then we'll probably go into alien encounters. Suffice it to say that they are very malefic. But the positive elements of alien encounters tend only to be in the words, right? Like they'll show up, they'll announce they're here for peace and an end to climate change, and an end to nuclear war.
Nuclear exchange.
Yes. Nuclear extinct, yeah. And then none of what they do is anything in common with this. And it involves, well, I mean, most of you have seen like weird surgeries, insertions, perversities.
Probings.
Yeah, probings with limbs. The fifth limb, shall we say.
And to clear up some confusion, we are discussing alien abductions, like in the Betty and Barney Hill-esque.
Yeah, not that one in particular, but
those kinds, yeah.
Those kinds, yeah. Whereas you will have noticed consistently that, like, the words of fairies aren't the most reliable, and maybe they won't behave beneficently to you, but you can trust their actions. And if they give you a definite message, in the folklore, if they tell you, hey, they're not going to show up for world peace, they're going to show up and complain that you're putting too much poop in your stable and you need to muck it out because it's getting into their living room.
Yeah, much
and then
more
if you do,
like much more local concerns.
It's local and it's concrete.
Yeah,
right. It is like, and this is just general moral guidance. Is the more concrete the suggestion somebody is making to you, the more practicable. Whereas you can often tell when someone is feeding you a load of bollocks because of how broad it'll be to the point of complete inapplicability.
Right.
Like world, not to say that I like war, but world peace, however admirable as a vague ideal, is like you can't talk about world peace at all in practical terms, unless you are wielding billions of dollars at a national level, or claim to control governments from behind the scenes, which is why you see ancient alien stuff tied into conspiracy theories. Contrast this with, say, domestic peace, like much more attainable. Right?
Yeah.
You know they are fighting over money. The source of their money problems are A, I don't know, the wife spends too much on makeup, and B, the husband, I don't know, drinks too much. So you haunt them every time the man drinks. You, I don't know, chuck a rock at him until he gets the memo and cuts back on his drinking. And dump the late woman's makeup. And then eventually you get through to them and they stop spending so much money and their money troubles go away. Obviously, this is a gross oversimplification of people's money troubles, but you can see how it, like, much more practicable.
Yeah.
And most, not to, like right now we're in the middle of a recession, but generally most people's money troubles or marital problems, when they tie into money troubles, can in fact be solved. It takes hard work, but they can in fact be solved. Maybe not now, but generally.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that I think is just, there's just little reason to make the equation between fairies and aliens. Tends to be rationalism, and it just falls through. We will be revisiting aliens later, deep diving on the abduction encounters, the interpretations those encounters have been given in New Age circles, and in a lot of new alien religions. I don't know if there's anything else you want to bring up, Ryan.
I think that's all. I think I'm set. I think we got everything we wanted to off our chests.
All right. Yeah, we'll be doing a second stream to present a positive view of fairies. This stream, like, we listed a whole bunch of random features, but we didn't really tie them together. And then we basically cleared junk theories. We'll be revisiting this next week to talk about what if we had to advance a positive case about what is a fairy, what would we say? Such as, like, if any of you enjoy reading Christian theology, like the providing the Chesterton's orthodoxy to Chesterton's heretics. The Sunday stream will be rescheduled to Saturday at 9. I may still do a Sunday stream, but it'll be by myself. Hound and I will be discussing the anime Pope and the basics of textual hermeneutics. So yeah, just expect our usual Sunday stream to be on Saturday. I may still do a Sunday stream. I want to talk about why to see racism is a terrible analog for real life racism. So yeah, expect, maybe not this Sunday, but expect that soon. And yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure. I am Wild Philosophy. This has been Ryan Rose, and we wish you a wonderful evening.
Go with the gnomes, my friends.
Go with the gnomes.